Is it better to be bad or boring? A question that has probably never actually plagued our minds, but something I decided that we should probably actually dig into, because I don't know. I think a lot of people say bad. I don't think it makes sense. I'm Chris, Meekness fan. With me today, Nico.
What's up, gamers?
I gave him some relief. Moriarty. Hi, hello.
Thank you.
Hello.
And Kevin, the Golden Bolt.
I'm both bad and boring.
Oh, well, what's that like?
It's, every day is a struggle. I get out of bed and I eat bran flakes and no milk. It's water. And I stare into the abyss and think that I should buy some kind of boat. But then I realize I live in a landlocked state. And I go to bed and I can't even cry because it's boring. Like, crying would show emotion, but bad and boring means that I just have to stay at this level all the time.
Isn't Bad and Boring a song?
It is now, by hit singer All Hail Buckets. It's a story of the life of whatever character I just made up. That sounds really damn depressing.
It did sound really depressing. The brand with water was gross, boring, and bad all at once. So yeah, this came to our mind recently, and I think I really resonated with it because growing up on especially like gaming YouTube, right, where there were years and years of angry gaming YouTubers very upset at the worst video games imaginable, you would hear a refrain sometimes where it's like, well, it's better to be bad than boring because at least I'll remember bad, or at least there's something to be extracted from critically or something with bad. And I think that was a very self-serving viewpoint. Sounds very pointed in a way I don't want it to, but I think maybe what they were doing with their free time perhaps colored the perspective on that, because I don't know if it's actually better for something to be bad generally, right? If you're doing that, of course, you have a lot more to riff on. There's a lot more to say about Sonic 06 than whatever mediocre Sonic game suits your fancy. Everyone has a different opinion, right? But Sonic 06 was kind of the poster child, right? Superman 64, White Knight Chronicles 1. Let's go with that. Throw a deep cut in there. How about that one? But
Was that bad? Was that bad?
I don't know. We'll see what people say.
See, I was just going to say, anybody who you've ever heard say that it's better to be bad than boring, tell them that the Crubcast says they're wrong, and then link this episode timestamp exactly now, 2 minutes and 45 seconds into this podcast, I'm guessing. I don't care. And then we'll get hate mail from all those other creators, most of whom don't check the comments anymore. So I think that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, pretty cool. Just
Yeah.
like Clank being a robot.
Clank is a robot.
Yeah.
So I guess the first thing is to kind of lay it out, right? Like, the argument is it's better to be bad than boring because, right? Like, how many times have we seen an IGN or I guess the guy that I've seen do it the most is maybe Gene Park say something like, oh, well, it made the cardinal sin of being boring. And yeah, right, that is certainly something that sucks about a game. And it feels like somebody who originally wrote that, whoever it was back, 10 years, 20 years, I don't know how long this has been a saying, but somebody back then said, oh, the cardinal sin, and it was probably about a Call of Duty, right? The cardinal sin of being boring instead of bad. But is that really the cardinal sin? Because I tell you what, man, there are some terrible games out there. There's some games that are really, really, really unenjoyable. I've played them and been like, why did I waste my time?
Shamu's Deep Sea Adventures.
Shamu, right? Like, Shamu's just like deeply dissatisfying to play the
It's
whole
also
time.
both. It's bad, it's boring. Like, they're not mutually exclusive concepts, and the concept of boring is something that obviously similar to bad, but bad's a little more a little easier to look at from an objective critical lens. Like, you can say that in a technical sense, X game is a bad game because it fails at its goals or whatever. Boring games, like Days Gone, is a game that exists, and I know people who are very casual players that are like, that game's really fun. And I enjoyed it, and I played the whole 30-hour story, and I think about Deacon St. John and Boozer every day. And I look at those people, and I question every taste they have after that, because that's their taste, and that game wasn't boring to them. but goddamn, that game's boring.
It is. It's a really boring game.
Look, I cried when Booster's arm got lit on fire. I thought that was very emotionally affecting. And then a bear swiped me through a gas station roof, and that's all I remember about that game.
I was watching you play that.
Oh, yeah.
I played like 10 hours of it, and none of it really stuck with me, which I guess would be the counter argument to kind of how I feel, right? It's like, well, if all I can remember from the game I found boring was like two things, right? And one of those I said ironically, of course, right? Booster got his arm lit up. That was kind of funny, right? But I feel like it was just a weird, I don't know, if you were to chart this out, right? A bad game starts off kind of here because you can at least look at it and laugh at it. Like with Shamu, that's kind of our go-to example. If you don't know Shamu's Deep Sea Adventure, just look up some clips on YouTube. It's kind of funny at first, right? You're like, why is there a SeaWorld game? Why is the manatee called Horatio? Why does he say there are cool postcards underwater? Like there's all these things that are funny. And then it flatlines as you realize, oh, this is a deeply unenjoyable actual experience past like 10 minutes.
I'm going to jump in because I realized as you were describing Shamu that the person that made me review Shamu is the person that likes Days Gone.
Oh, it's the same person. Yep. That's right.
So this is like a condition then.
Yeah, well, to be fair, it was their parents got them a bunch of shovelware games all the time for some reason. Not ironically. They would just buy
a ton of shovelware
video games.
Yeah.
I see.
Like legit. Well, but they're also like a chronic player of Football Manager as well.
Yeah, they went from sports games and Ubisoft to sports games and
menu
third-person open world PlayStation games and spreadsheets.
Dude, the Football Manager one is actually like really funny, but really cool if you're a fan of football and you're a fan of like spreadsheets like I am. But yeah, everything else that was just really funny. The shovelware and Shamu.
Right. But yeah, I guess it's a thing where like if you were to chart it out, maybe it starts higher than a boring game, but I feel like it dips lower than a boring game after a point. Because the boring game, I think by definition, is just kind of middle of the road. There's no ups and downs to the experience. It's just kind of flatline, right? And I don't know if like the 5 minutes of enjoyment of Shamu I got from laughing at it ever outweighed the, how long is that game? 3-4 hours of having to play the rest of it?
Should only be 3, but it's longer. It's like 4.5.
Well, every time you get stuck, with Poseidon for an hour, or
there's the Poseidon fight's a crapshoot. There's the you need air, and sometimes they don't give you air anymore, so you just drown and start over.
Right.
They still make you get air in that game?
Yeah.
You are a whale. Yeah.
You have to do a Street Fighter input for the final boss, but it doesn't register 9 times.
Only time in the game that they make you do a behind the back Street Fighter fight against a Poseidon.
Yeah.
So wow. I think that perhaps what I can do is I can provide a couple of arguments here, both for and against, and maybe we can examine them a little bit. And I think maybe I'll start with the boring side because it's the most common one, right? And I think that we can start with the idea that it is something of a breach of contract for a game to be boring, right? Because the idea of a game is that it promises to be entertaining and engaging, and a boring game will sort of inherently fail that premise, or I guess promise, leaving me as the player feeling, cheated. So I guess in that case, I would compare it to buying a meal that was inedible versus buying a meal that was not pleasing.
There is an angle that comes out of that, though, that especially in the modern day, boring games actually are sometimes sought out by design. I don't mean this as a derogatory, but Power Wash Simulator is an inherently boring video game. It is,
and I love it. Yeah,
and it is meant to be boring because it is meant to be a palate cleanser.
I feel like boring and meditative are two different things, right? Like if you think about a Minecraft, I can see people saying that's boring, right? But if you look at it from the lens of like being a little bit meditative or a little bit just like passive? You're saying, Kevin, a reset, passive, peaceful,
but
right? All these other adjectives, I don't know that boring is
meditation
the most
is just weaponized
holistic.
boredom.
meditation is just weaponized boredom.
The idea of meditation is to actively, at least in like the Buddhist monk sense, actively expel any thoughts and just exist in the moment. You're allowed to let thoughts in. You just have to think, no, I have to put those to the side. It is meant to be a state of nothing, which is what boring is. It is a state of nothing.
I don't know.
Any boring
I feel
game
like
can
there's
be meditative if you want it to, but there are some that are designed in that sense. It has one mechanic.
I have a bit of a distinction for me personally between the lack of thought and something being actively against me being entertained, if that makes sense.
But what I'm saying is that a game that is designed with one mechanic in mind, and that mechanic is specifically meant to be nothing. Football Manager can be the same thing in that sense, but those games are designed to be boring. They're not designed to be these meditative experiences. Like Train Simulator is not meant to be a meditative experience. It's meant to be a nothing experience for the people that want that relaxing nothingness to help them meditate. That doesn't make it not inherently a boring experience.
That's a better example than something like a Power Wash Simulator. I feel like Power Wash Simulator has that like element of satisfying to it. And yeah, that's one mechanic, but it's at least slightly
I'm confused on this because I feel
engaging.
like at least with the Train Simulator, you have a whole train array to keep track of, whereas with Power Wash, it's literally spray.
Yeah, it sounds to me that this is more of a Nico's personal opinion on it. But the thing is that what's boring is going to be very, very personal to all of us.
Yeah, it's a subjective thing all around.
Exactly. I find some of the most successful games in the world to be incredibly dull. But that's not necessarily the thing, right? Like, I guess in this case, we're kind of talking about the idea of lost potential. So a bad game might offer some elements of enjoyment, a compelling story or innovative mechanics, something like that. But then a boring game squanders that potential entirely, offering nothing, right? So in that particular case, is this sort of boring of a passive indifference versus the bad of active displeasure, right?
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to push us towards, is like the idea that the concept of boring in itself is one we have to explore a little bit before we get to the definition of what we're calling a boring game, because there are boring games that are good. And
I think if we're going with the definition of boredom, right, I would say that it's a state of apathy more than sort of not doing anything. It's not caring about what you're doing.
Yeah,
right?
and lost potential is a great way to put that.
If we're playing Power Wash Simulator, which I love, and if you haven't played it, it's a great experience, especially if you've got a friend or whatever, and you want to like spend a couple hours just kind of talking, which is what it's become for me. It's an opportunity for me to have a conversation with somebody while kind of mindlessly doing something, because you want to hang out with friends, but you also want to not be staring blankly into the void of the monitor in front of you. Well, here you go. You can just kind of play this game and not be staring into the void, but be staring at the Power Wash. It's a good experience for that.
Well, and I mean, and I will say this, right? I'm thinking of boring as something that actively disengages me.
Right, so apathy. Apathy, I think, is the most important part, is that you don't feel anything, that you don't care about it, that it's a drain on your energy or a drain on your enthusiasm, that you feel empty and, as you mentioned, disengaged. And I think maybe the best thing to say here is that it feels like you've wasted your time.
Yeah, well, and that's why I'm saying, like, I'm not out here like fighting for Power Wash Simulator specifically. That's not a hill that I really want to die on, but like, as far as my personal view of like what boredom is, I'm trying to like put that to the side. I'm trying to get to like a central idea of like, this is what a boring game is. right?
Chris,
And
let
that's
me, oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I thought you were
well,
going there.
you know, I guess that's why for me it's games like, Callisto Protocol that we had like spoken about briefly on the pre-show, where that game has a story and it's not a nothing game like these singular mechanic games are, right? Like, so it's clearly not like designed to be boring, but it's boring because the story doesn't make you engage with it, if that makes sense. Like, it just kind of exists.
And that goes back to M's lost potential thought, which is why I was gonna jump to Chris, but you did mention before we go to Chris that we stream these live on Twitch at Crub_official with exclusive pre and post show content. We were talking earlier today about the weather, so we did it again, and it's much more interesting than it sounds. We have a lot of fun on the pre and post shows.
We played pal name, Pokemon name. We made Nico guess which was what was fake, what we made up. We had more fun than that.
I had already washed that out of my memory with Power Watch Simulator. But yeah, we are streaming these on Twitch every Tuesday around 7 p.m. Eastern with the pre-show around 6:30. We also have a Patreon with a bunch of exclusive bonus content, much more that should be coming up in the next month or two with some cool things that we're starting up that I'm really excited for personally. That I think you guys will enjoy. The Patreon tiers are changing very, very soon, so if you want to get in and get every piece of content we've ever done and ever will do, the Founder tier, it's $5 a month. It's going away soon, and it will be replaced with something that is probably more expensive, I'm going to guess, because less expensive would be weird. Anyway.
We're silly, but not that silly.
Oh, yeah. And crub.org/join our public Discord. That's right. You can be in the same Discord server with us.
Yeah.
It's free.
You can hang out, you can chat. We've had a really active community over there already, which is really cool. Mm-hmm. What I was going to jump to you, Chris, with was M had mentioned the idea of the lost potential as like one of the potential definitions for boring. And I want to throw a question to you. Could that not also apply to bad?
I would agree. I'm with you on that. I think that could definitely apply to, you'll see people say even good games have lost potential, right? I guess at a point that's critique in general, but putting that aside, yeah, I would say so. I guess for me, it's not so much that lost potential is even a driving factor in thinking about some of these things this way, though it is a part of it, right? So I just look at that blankly and I'm like, yeah, probably for both cases.
Do you have any specific games that jump to you immediately with both bored and bad? Or boring and bad, I should say, rather, that you want to highlight and soapbox or dunk on for a bit?
Oh, I guess. We use Balan Wonderworld in the promotional tweet, right? Which is extremely the definition of bad in terms of confounding design decisions, but also boring in that even if you manage to stomach those and get through with it, it is still a game where you can sometimes jump and sometimes can't jump, going through these very basic, stale, plain, geometrically designed environments, right? There's a little excitement, there's a little sense to a lot of the things in Balan Wonderworld. Is very much just a game that exists and you can technically complete. And it's kind of funny up front. Again, kind of like Shamu, you look at it and you're like, oh, haha, you can't jump, haha, all this stuff. And then you just keep playing and it is just kind of a waste of your time. Unless you like it. Maybe you'll play it and it does something for you. And it's not a waste of your time. But for me, it was a waste of my time.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the problem is then you like it. And so for me, I think in some way I keep going back to food for this in my head, right? Like it's being served a meal. And I think that the difference is whether or not I feel that I'm being respected as the consumer, right? So a developer might be creating a bad game because they're misguided or they lack resources or they're bad or whatever, right? Like there's lots of reasons why you might get a, quote, bad game. However, it is still attempting to be enjoyable. It is still attempting to give me this good experience. And that is me being given this burnt or undercooked meal that, if it had been done differently, it could have been good, versus being given a perfunctory, bland piece of chicken. Here you go. This is food. You are now eating protein, right?
It's an MRE.
Right. Which is there. It's when it's boring, it feels like it's feels like it's indifference to my experience. Right. So I think that there is somewhat sort of with crime, right? Like the idea of crime, there's intent involved. So if you don't intend to commit a crime, did you commit a crime is a philosophical question, right? Which is like why there's the idea of manslaughter versus murder, right? Because you didn't intend to commit it, but we still think it's bad.
It's a crime not to hit the like button on YouTube, by the way.
That's a good point.
But the point being that if you didn't intend to if you were trying to give me something really good, right? What's that guy? He's famous. The Yan Deer, is that how you say it? I've never said
JTAR 9?
Oh.
Yandere?
Famous?
Yandere?
Yes. Oh, Yandere Dev. Yeah.
So is he giving you something that is bad, but he's trying to give it to you good, right? Or is he not caring what your experience is and you're getting something that you don't, I think that's sort of my delineation between bad and boring personally. Because obviously there's the subjectivity of boring, right? What might be boring to you, we were talking about it with Days Gone.
Minecraft, Days Gone, yeah.
Right, I find Days Gone to be incredibly boring. I think it's just one of the most boring experiences, just kind of trundling along doing nothing for hours and hours. And, I love Starkiller, right? He's such a great actor, but like, boy, is that whole game just incredibly dull. But as Kevin said, there are some people who think that's one of the best games that they've ever played and they love it. So I think that the subjectivity of it kind of removes the ability to just blandly label something, or I guess broadly label something as bad or boring, because, subjective experience is debatable.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that, especially because of how I feel about turn-based games. I'm not going to sit here and say they're boring, because I think this one is one of the examples that is extremely subjective to just me, in that if something doesn't like demand that I am attentive to it, I won't be attentive to it. And so that's why a turn-based game actively turns me off and actively makes me apathetic towards it. But I think, finding your why is very important. Because obviously there are reasons that a game like a Shamu would be enjoyable for an hour, right? And there are reasons that something like, Balan might not be, right? Or something like Callisto Protocol might not be, or something like Evil Within might not be. And yeah, I think I just needed to throw that point out there, in that
I got you.
With the subjectivity of all of it, finding out why you think it's boring versus why you think it's just bad but fun,
I guess
lead to some interesting revelations. Go, Chris.
I guess that's kind of where I'm coming to in this conversation, I guess. Because no matter what, I can't remove the fact that I want to know why it is bad and why it is boring in both realms, right? It's harder for me to just sit back and turn my brain off and evaluate which one is right, because Days Gone got me thinking, and I was like, on every level that's like a completely fine game, I think, right? Or completely decent, there's nothing really broken or bad, or I would say even like kind of just outright wrong in that game, at least like from a general broad perspective. And I can't even sit here and remove myself from the fact that I want to look at it and figure out why it bores me. You know what I mean? Because like the gunplay was fine, motorcycle stuff's fine, the zombie stuff, it's fine, right?
You've done it all before. There's a lot of it in that game's case.
Yeah. So maybe that's my issue for like consuming too much, right? At a point.
And also it's the fact that it's this 35, 40 hour experience. Do you want to entertain having to fuel up your bike for 35 to 40 hours? Some people would say yes. Metro is a franchise that thrives off of limited resources, and I often like the idea of limited resources in games, but it's much harder to pull off well. So that's one of those things where if you can't keep people not all people, not even most people, but if you can't keep a chunk of your core audience significantly entertained enough to get to the point in the game where they're willing to finish it, not necessarily like you have to have a perfect ride from start to end, but if it's like I'm 60% through and it's kind of getting a little boring, but I want to stick through it, then to some level you've succeeded. And then that makes for a really difficult conversation, because people don't tend to finish video games by and large. This is a very tuned in conversation here. The friend of mine and Nico's that liked Days Gone, I don't know that they finished it. They
No
very
idea,
well might
yeah.
not have. They might have just played it for 2 hours and said it was good. Yeah, most likely they didn't.
Yeah.
And that makes for an interesting conversation. On top of that because we're tuned in, A, we have that more critical lens, and B, we're both more and less likely to. I saw this in the Twitch chat, so I'm gonna cop the phrase "cope a bad game into being good."
Yeah, I did resonate with that. Yeah.
Like, because
I do that all the time, man.
we take these flawed experiences, especially in the content creation field, and if it's something that means something to us, Legend of Dragoon is a great example. That game is very flawed, but that doesn't mean that it didn't resonate in a way that we wanted to talk about how the flaws don't matter to the core of the experience, even if they matter still. And
Right.
there are two sides of this coin, because the casual player might just say, I liked that, and then never think about it again. And never think about why they liked it, never think about if they actually liked it, or if it was just, well, that took my mind for an hour, so I guess that was fun.
I didn't think about my terrible job and everything going wrong for a bit, right?
Ugh.
Yeah. And I guess like Legend of Dragoon is a great example, because I think that's where I'd hope to olive branch out to someone who loves Days Gone and is like, how could you even insinuate that it's less than good? People don't go to Legend of Dragoon. People outright hate that game sometimes and call it a knockoff and rip off. And like, I like it a lot. I thought it was pretty cool.
It's a
I played
very,
it recently.
very rad game.
Yeah. So just for Days Gone fans, I get it. So don't be too mad. Sorry.
It's kind of putting your
that's
toes
valid.
into two different discussions there, though, right? Like the lack of critical thought, because we know that this is a common thing. And it's more prevalent amongst, I think, maybe people like us who spend all day being critical, right? And as you learn to be critical, you start being critical of more things, and then you become critical. And, then there's the group of people who think that critical means negative, which it doesn't.
Yep.
Right? So there's sort of that concept there as to whether or not, when we're talking about, oh, it's boring, they really mean bad, but they don't have the sort of critical wherewithal yet built within themselves to be able to say why they think it's bad or why they think it's boring. I think that's certainly a discussion to be had. And then there's also the sort of degrees of badness discussion, right? Which I think is maybe more relevant to this particular topic, because some games can be atrociously buggy and broken and offensive. But some games are just kind of not very good. And I think perhaps not very good ends up being considered boring more than anything else.
And there's also, sorry, hi dog. I don't know what he barked at. He just heard something. We'll cut that out of the audio version so you won't hear the bark. What I was going to say was, there's also the angle of, while we're still talking about that idea of the critical lens, you have critics like a Gene Park who are, not to put them in particular on blast, they are going out of their way to their job is to recommend stuff to the casual consumer. So then are they judging boring by the barometer of what a regular player would consider boring? That's another angle to dive into it. And I had a follow-up thought, but I will leave that to one of you while I go see what the hell my dog wants.
Yeah.
Audiences, or rather demographic, is, I think, very important in this. And I think that's a valuable point that Kevin brought up, which is that if I am telling you that a game is boring, if I am saying, oh, this game is boring and I don't think you would like it, right? That is a whole different sort of discussion than me saying, I think this game is boring and I don't like it. audience is very important there. If I am a professional journalist working for IGN, right, and I'm getting paid $3 an hour to review this JRPG, and I say, oh, it's boring, then perhaps I don't mean that I didn't like it or that it's bad, right? Perhaps I'm just saying that 51% of people will not like it.
Yeah. It brings into question the critical lens of the critics to some degree, which I don't mean as a disparagement to them.
But I'll say about this, right? Sorry, the critics is something I need to bounce off of, because I feel like nowadays with the current internet climate, I feel like it's hard, and I feel like a lot of critics just simply don't play enough of a game to know. I mean, not you guys, obviously. I know that you guys obviously, and you say it in your videos, either complete the games or play enough of the games, or I know you have a rule of like X amount of hours. If it doesn't grip you by then, you consider it chunder. But I don't think enough critics play enough of the games to be able to say whether they're boring or not.
I don't know that we can really make that call.
You don't think
that's
so?
Very, very, very case by case.
Because I've been accused of not playing a game that I've 100%ed for a video.
Interesting.
Like people are going
being accused of it is different from like.
But they'll say you didn't talk about this, therefore you didn't play the whole game.
Yeah, I guess so. But when you get a 4 score for a game that you literally can't boot up, it kind of feels disingenuous.
That's
Cyberpunk?
That's the editor that made that score, not the writer. So,
yeah, the Cyberpunk discussion, because right, like when we're talking about scores, and we shouldn't be, because we're going off into the weeds there. But when we're talking about something like a Cyberpunk, I think that this comes into the idea of redemption, right? Where a bad game can be patched and it can be updated and it can receive a sequel, right? And you can improve on the flaws of this. And I think No Man's Sky and Cyberpunk are really good examples of that, which were almost objectively bad, right? They weren't boring. They were just objectively broken games that had whatever in it. And I think maybe even No Man's Sky, you could say, was boring, and that was its bad part of it. Where a bad game can be patched, right? It can be updated, it can be improved, but a boring game, maybe conceptually boring, where the core gameplay loop is not enjoyable and it induces apathy, it's fundamentally stuck in this uninspired state. And so there's kind of no hope for future improvement there.
Yeah, I mean, Bethesda makes its whole career off of games that start out broken and turn out good by the end thanks to modders.
Yeah.
So that's like, it's been a thing for a long, long time that's been the case. It's funny that the oft shared Miyamoto quote is now kind of flipped on its head, because a game that comes out too early can be bad, but there are good examples of them being fixed if it has the right mindset behind it. If you have the vision and the funding to get all the way through and fix it. That's a completely different discussion, though, than we were going to have. I don't remember quite where I wanted to jump into with, or jump back into with the critical lens, but I'll circle back in case there was anything that we had missed to the idea of the critics calling a game boring without necessarily calling it boring with the audience of the review in mind, with the recommendation in mind. Because, and again, this is still into the weeds, but speaking on a personal level, I've been bored by games that I've recommended in reviews, but that's solely because they give me 4 days to review it. That's a whole different issue, but that's a thing that real reviewers also have to deal with, and they probably get paid less than I do at this point. So there's that angle, and there's the angle of the media versus the individual consumer, and whether at a point you start falling out of touch a little. Again, I don't mean that as a disparagement to, I know we brought up Gene Park. I don't mean that as a shot on him at all. But
it's just the play environment's so different, right?
Exactly. Like when you're playing a game for your job, it's inherently different. And I think, you kind of touched on that when I was dealing with Dog. So thank you.
Yeah, because there are some times like we'll get, like launch day game code, right? And it's like the pressure is both on and off at that point. Off because like you'll probably finish that review when it's past its time. So at a point you can kind of take your time, but it's also then you're kind of going in like, ugh, okay, well, I may as well do anything else right now, right? May as well do anything else right now. Great grammar.
That's currently where I am at the time of recording with a project.
Whereas for most people, you know, I like, again, it kind of got me thinking of what we were talking about, right? Like most people don't finish games, which I think reframes it for a lot of people because it's like, yeah, maybe someone got Days Gone for like $10 at GameStop, played it 3 times and went like, yeah, I don't know, that was cool. And that's all they ever think about that game. And it's completely fine. And it's completely whatever, you know, it's not bad or boring to them even. It just fulfilled a perfunctory ancillary role to their life. And then it's gone. And that's all it ever really needed to be. Right.
Yeah.
Especially amongst like us, like I think us four especially are very geared to thinking about a game in its totality. Right. We are very geared toward wanting to finish the game. We want to see the credits. We want to hit the end or an end point after or before that. Right. And think about the experience as a whole and judge from there. And I think maybe there's also some disconnect where it's like a lot of people probably just don't think that way. If you're into gaming YouTube and watching gaming YouTube videos, you're probably closer to us on that, right? But for most people,
that's why you'd be tuned into this conversation of bad versus boring at all, because you've heard the content creators that say that. And to go back to that point, the whole origin of that topic to begin with is insert content creator here saying that, and it's because, like you said at the start of the podcast, it's because that creator has more that they can do joke-wise on a bad game versus a boring game.
Their evil clone from the future is giving them a rougher time, handing them
that's actually, I think, maybe my idea of what the point or where that comes into that statement of, oh, it's worst cardinal sin of being bad or boring, right? I think that we have to take into account the audience that is saying that, right? And that is absolutely journalists and content creators and people who are trying to talk about a game. And if you give me this thing that I can't talk about, right? So if I'm the person who's writing the cardinal sin of Call of Duty is that it's boring, right? I'm saying that because I have absolutely nothing else to say about this game, and I have to. Because if I'm a random, and we, just by virtue of listening to this podcast or watching it live or whatever, you are automatically not in the bottom like 80% of gamers, right? You're not a normal everyday gamer, because the normal everyday gamer plays 1 game a year or 2 games a year, and that's it. Right? Like the average number of games is like 3 outside of mobile gaming. So you're not going to be that person just by virtue of listening to this. And you need to kind of, I think, be thinking about that person, who is the person that's picking this up and saying, oh, this is boring. I don't know. And whether that's ease of expression from the journalist, right? To be able to say, oh, it's boring, without trying to go into the effort that is required to delve into the specific issues or the mechanics or whatever, and making it a quick and sort of convenient way to express dissatisfaction. Or it's the player who has the lack of vocabulary and the sort of, detailed critique knowledge of specific terms and concepts and whatever. Whichever one, I think that boring just ends up being audience oriented. I have to say this because I have nothing else to say.
Interesting.
Because
you do have to consider the reader's eyes glazing over, who's John I don't know, guy who works a 9 to 5 or is at the factory, right? And it's just like, does it work? Does the game work when I put it in?
And it depends it depends on the outlet you're also talking about, not in terms of the individual, but in terms of the audience, because we know that IGN reviews can affect game sales. That's a thing. And so the IGN reviews do have to be the most boilerplate thing that you can think of, because that's the audience for it. I'm not going to make a boilerplate review for my audience unless I have a game early enough that I know that there's the algorithmic chance that it reaches a more casual audience.
Right.
And it's a whole different style of reviewing versus the stuff that any of us have ever thought of making outside of that new content, because that is an outreach in its own. And you're going to get people saying frequently, "You're too mean to this game. Why did you hate on this part?" When it's just like, "Oh, I thought the collectibles were dumb," or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there was like, "Oh, there's too many of them," and that the lack of gaming literacy, to kind of go back to what you were saying, comes into play there, because people don't know that being critical isn't hating.
Right.
Yeah.
For me to say, oh, it has repetitive gameplay or an uninspired story or clunky controls, or worse, it has a lack of challenge, right? Like, none of that is me saying this game is inherently bad. But if you are being critical, you are being negative in a lot of people's minds. And what's interesting is that if I were to simply sum all that up and say, well, it's kind of boring, they'd be like, well,
Yeah, because they would just say, oh, it's so fun,
Yeah.
So the thing for me, right, is like, I think I don't know. I don't really care how game reviewers say it, to be honest with you. Like, if a game feels boring, it's going to feel boring. I think it's better to have a game that's fun, even if it's not executed as well as maybe something that's executed well. But I think that I do think that games should be sort of have an entertainment value to them, right? Like, maybe fun isn't the right word for it, but having some kind of value outside of, just a base level, you're doing something, which, for some people, like we said earlier, that could be meditation. For other people, that could be they just want some kind of distraction, like Chris said before. Or for other people, that could be, repetition, like me, right? I like repetition in my games. Other people might consider that boring. But I think as soon as you get into a territory of like your game not having some sort of something to offer the right person, I think that is actually worse than simply maybe not being able to execute on optimization or graphics or even writing to a certain degree. Because if you can hit that campiness, then like you're fine.
So are you saying bad or boring is better?
I am saying that bad is better. It's not perfect. It's obviously bad still.
Right.
But it's better than something that is actively unfun. And I think that's where I draw the line, is when something is actively unfun. To me, it could be a different thing from what's unfun to you. But if I want to stop playing it, if I don't want to turn it on again, that's when I'm like, okay, yeah, this is hit the boring mark. And you guys know me, I'll finish something even if it's bad. Like, I finished, a lot of things actually. But if something is boring, sorry, jump to Kevin.
Well, to jump back to what you were saying is, I don't think you have to care what reviewers or content creators think. It's just that this discussion exists because of them or us. Like, you can't tell the story of this topic without talking about the origin of it, and the reason that it comes up so frequently is because of media.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's true.
I think
it is based entirely on media, for sure.
I think you also touched on something we have not touched so far, which maybe the end point for it is that a bad game also can become boring very quickly, is kind of the unspoken issue.
Yeah,
Shamu.
Absolutely. Shamu, like
Shamu
you said, Chris.
example.
Yeah. And I mean, The Room kind of became that for me in terms of like movies, right? Like, I'm not going to say I'm there with Tommy Wiseau himself, but I am there with The Room. Like, I don't think it's as funny anymore now as it was the second time I watched it. The first time I got too invested in the story.
Let's not.
We're not. We don't have to. I'm just. That's the beginning and end of that story.
I think the term fun that keeps being used here is equally bad, to be clear. I think that using fun is equally bad as boring. It is as subjective, and it lacks as much detail. Saying a game is fun tells me nothing more about its strengths or weaknesses. It's not actionable in any way.
it's a category more so than it is an actual descriptor. Like,
I think
you have
it's
to
a
say
shallow
it's fun
assessment.
because
I think it's just the same sort of shallow assessment as boring, right?
Right, but if you say it's fun because or it's boring because and then you go on, like I feel like that's like you can have substance there. I feel like it's just a starting, like a jumping off point.
I mean, that
You know?
becomes a question of the nuanced discussion, which again comes down to if you're either a critic or have a critical lens, which again, if you're in the audience that is listening to this podcast, then yes, you do. But the wide group of people that aren't tuned into that, that's not the case. And we know that there are a lot of, for lack of a better term, normal people that watch the content creators that call this stuff bad or boring and say that bad is better than boring and all that stuff. And that becomes a thing that gets parroted because there's less.
It's pithy.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it.
That's really what it is. It's pithy to overgeneralize. It makes for a good, headline term. Oh, critical sin. Boring. And it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. That's a nice way to kick this game that you didn't really enjoy very much. But I do think that it ultimately is shallow. It lacks detail, and it's a subjective sort of statement.
And that gets repeated and parroted nowadays in the content creator era.
Mm-hmm.
How many times... How many times do you have Sonic 06 get dunked on relentlessly because it was the go-to dunk on game and it became a vicious cycle? It deserves it, but that turned into dunking on an entire franchise.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, and I agree. I feel like that's an interesting point too of like, sort of the power of the collective discourse in determining the future of something, right? A bunch of people could probably find Sonic 06 to be not boring. I'm sure they're out there.
It's not boring for the first couple hours. After that, it can get there.
Sure.
But.
Right. Well, and it's... So I do agree with them to a certain point that, like, just simply putting that out there with no context and just saying this is boring and stopping at that, 100%. Shallow.
Which is the issue. That's
absolutely.
what's happening.
That's how this topic came up.
Right, but I just don't think that it's always that. I don't think that it's always a shallow thing to say. I think that it can be used as a springboard, like I was saying before. I don't think it's always bad.
We weren't disagreeing with you. We're just explaining the way that this discussion started to begin with years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important to the context of the discussion because you can call a thing boring, but putting the debate forward of bad or boring is, like Em said, putting two nebulous debates or two nebulous words head to head in a debate, and you're going to get a third nebulous response, which is actually it's fun or actually it's good. So there's 4 words that mean nothing then.
That is very true. They mean nothing on their own. Absolutely.
Like, you do need the context to say that. And to be fair, and there are some cases, friends of the channel in the content space have used that as an example at the end of a video. And I still don't personally like that phrasing of it, but that's sort of like their wrap up of what else can I say?
Yeah, kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah, like, and that's mixed bag is a thing that you see all the time in traditional reviews. It's just that this is the content creator version of that.
Mm-hmm.
See, I think mixed bag is even lazier of a response, to be honest.
Well, it's all very, very shallow, right? And I understand that it makes it easy, right? It's very easy to point at some of these games that have come out and say, oh, Crackdown 3 is boring. Oh, Babylon's Fall is boring. Mass Effect Andromeda is boring. But I think that ultimately, when you say that those things, right, is Mass Effect Andromeda actually boring? No, it's bad because it's broken and buggy and it came out and then it was fixed, right? There's a whole nother part of the context that's missing there. It evolved. Do you remember that game? The asymmetric 4 or 5 on 1 thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? Like, that game, it famously, it's boring, committed the cardinal sin of being boring. No, it wasn't boring. It wasn't boring at all. It was a asymmetric multiplayer game that just unfortunately didn't spend a whole lot of time figuring out how to make 4v1 a lot of fun, but it wasn't boring. It was just kind of broken unless you were the monster. You know, like there's these issues where you need further context, and it really does. the problem, I don't want to rant, right? But the problem I have with these is that it ends up feeling like it is just a simple way to not be literate, right? And I don't mean that in the terms of reading, but, being literate about the media that you're engaging in. And I hate the term media literacy, too, because it's becoming a catch-all for everything. But if you're going to engage in these things, then you should know what you're talking about, right? If you're going to engage in them and you're going to have an opinion, maybe don't just repeat my opinion because I said it.
Yes. That was a thing that I was going to say near the end of my last thought, which is a thing that I've said frequently on games that I feel mixed on, is don't let my opinion be a substitute for your experience. Like, even if I'm not recommending a thing, it doesn't mean that you can't like it. It doesn't mean that I'm insulting you personally by saying it's not a thing that I think I can recommend to the casual player or anything of that sort. But that's not a thing that
I love that saying,
you
by
hear
the way.
a lot. Thanks.
I don't think that you need to play Crackdown 3 or Fallout 76 in order to know that they are not good. This is the whole concept of reviews. It's the whole concept of sort of the creator space, is that you don't have to do that, right? Mm-hmm. Someone else can do that for you, and you can learn about that, and you can be a part of the discussion about how Fallout 76 is not a great game when it launched. I don't know if it's good now, because I'm never going to play it because of how bad it was when it launched.
They're in Atlantic City now.
Chris,
I don't know why, but they are.
Yeah, that's cool that they did that, I guess. But the point is that I don't think you need to have that. But I'm never going to sit down and say, with some sort of confidence or authority, Fallout 76, trash game. What a terrible game. It's so boring. Because I don't know. And to just parrot that from somebody else ends up being illiterate.
I would hope that people would know not to take my opinion unless they directly align with me. Chris, do you have any words to say on the responsibility of using your opinion?
I have words that I'll say in lieu of Chris because there's currently a stream issue going on.
I was trying to get Chris to say something.
While Chris irons out that issue, I will say that we're going to cut this part out probably.
Okay, that's probably a good note to go out on.
That's a good note.
Thank you everyone for listening. I've been Chris, with me Kevin, we're already Nico. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Thank you for listening.
You should share your thoughts with us, specifically on Twitter, because this nuanced discussion needs only 128 characters. So only share the opinions with us. Twitter @CrubOfficial.
Isn't it 212 characters now?
I don't care.